Hi everyone, it's 314 Reactor here. Welcome back to the channel. Got some exciting news today. Cyberpunk 2077 just dropped its latest patch 1.62, introducing the much anticipated ray tracing overdrive mode, or as it's actually known, path tracing. But before we dive in, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all things on the channel. Now, for those of you wondering what path tracing is, it's an advanced rendering technique that simulates the behavior of light in a more realistic and comprehensive way compared to standard ray tracing. While ray tracing tracks a single ray back to its light source, path tracing generates multiple rays for each pixel, bouncing off in various directions. This results in better reflections, shadows, and overall lighting, making Night City even more immersive than ever before. In today's video, we'll be putting path tracing to the test by exploring various areas in the game, comparing visuals with path tracing on and off to see the difference it makes, and guess what? We're running it all on an RTX 4090, so you know we're going to be pushing those graphics to the absolute limit. We'll also be checking out DLAA, which is just added in this patch as well, and we'll be comparing it to DLSS in terms of frame rate and image quality. So strap in, because we're about to take a deep dive into the futuristic world of Cyberpunk 2077 with the new ray tracing overdrive mode on an RTX 4090. Let's get started. Alrighty, so let's have a look in the settings. So what we have now is DLAA enabled, which means we can actually run at native 4K internally and then apply dynamic learning anti-aliasing to that, which means all of the ray tracing will be running at full 4K, so it should look a lot better, but we will lose quite a few frames. Also, you can see as DLSS frame generation we have on, and DLSS super resolution currently set to quality. There's also settings for AMD Super FX Resolution 2.1 and Intel Xe Super Sampling 1.1, both of which should run in software on the shaders on the RTX 4090. We won't be doing too much of a deep dive into those today, we'll just be checking out some of DLAA, but we'll possibly look into these in a future video to check the image quality comparison. The real meat of this video is when we scroll down. So here we can see the usual ray tracing settings, but now there's also added in a path tracing technology preview setting, as well as a path tracing in photo mode setting. So if we switch off path tracing, you'll see the old ray tracing settings reappear: reflections, sun shadows, local shadows, and the lighting settings. But when we enable path tracing, all of those are just handled by the path tracer. Now, the fact that the path tracer sends out more rays and traces them all back to a pixel means you get a lot more detail in shadowing and lighting, and everything's just a lot more realistic. The best way to think of it is it's the same concept as ray tracing, it's just a little bit different, more intensive, and more accurate. So we can see this scene here, which looks absolutely gorgeous, and we are currently running at 83 FPS. So let's turn off the path tracer and go back to normal ray tracing. So as you see, it just looks a little bit less accurate in terms of the lighting and the shadowing, and as we go forward you'll see more of these details fill in, especially at night. Now if we turn ray tracing completely off, you see everything revert back to standard rasterization. The reflections in the water aren't as good, and they will disappear off screen as you look down, because it'll all be handled by screen space reflections and cube maps. So let's walk around a little bit. Remember, we're still in rasterization here, and we are running at over 100 frames a second. So if we go to this area here and we turn ray tracing back on, we are down to about 87 to 90 FPS, and shadowing looks a lot better, lighting looks a lot better. Now, if we crank on the path tracer, every single light source now has rays intersecting with them. So everything just has a lot more lighting to it, a lot more reflection to it. And you'll see extra shadowing under the cars, extra details, but we are down to around 60 FPS, even with DLSS 3. So it's very, very heavy running this. Now if we turn on DLAA, so now we are running at native 4K, which means all the rays shooting out will be at that 4K resolution, every single pixel, and then DLAA is being applied on top, which means we're getting quite a bit of a sharper image that looks really nice. The ray tracing reflections will all be much higher. The shadowing will be much more accurate, but we are down to 36 FPS. And if we turn off DLSS 3 frame generation, we are down to 20 FPS, even going into 19 FPS. So we're in the teens in terms of the frame rate. So this is pretty much the best that Cyberpunk can look at the moment. And it does look fantastic, but you can't really play it at 20 FPS. But if we go back to normal ray tracing, you see the frame rate has now gone up to 35, 36 FPS. But you can see the lighting on that shot there, the reflections in the floor, the shadowing around people just doesn't look as accurate. And if we turn ray tracing completely off, you can see it's gone up to 44 FPS, 45 FPS, which still isn't the best frame rate, but you can also see the visual quality is hugely impacted here. The reflections in the ground just don't look very good at all. They've got that classic sort of smear of screen space. The shadowing and lighting accuracy is all gone. Now if we turn the path tracer back on and then enable DLSS 3, and crank DLSS back to quality, which means we'll be running internally, I think Quad HD, and then upscaling and then adding anti-aliasing to that. We'll see that frame rate shoot right up to probably double. And there we are, 84 FPS, and the lighting is much more realistic, especially that area to the left is much more naturally lit. So if you imagine that at 4K we have 3840 by 2160 pixels, which is 8 million pixels. When you're running raw 4K with no DLSS and no frame generation, that's multiple rays from each pixel, 8 million pixels. Then all those rays bounce off geometry in random ways, producing more rays from that. Then it has to run all those calculations and put them all back to a fragment or a pixel. That is a lot of calculation going on there. That's why the frame rate is hit so bad, and that's why at the moment we need things like frame generation and DLSS upscaling in order to get that frame rate to an acceptable level. But the fact that we're generating frames, the fact that we're upscaling, and it still looks this incredible, and we are actually running path tracing in Cyberpunk and getting like 90 FPS. That's really good. The only thing is with DLSS 3, can't activate VSync because of the way that it works, unfortunately, because it's generating frames in between actual rendered frames. So you will get screen tearing. That's the only downside. Other than that, there's only a slight feeling of input delay. My god, it looks good. Oh man, look at that. If we go back to normal ray tracing, you can see a reflection along where those plants sit is completely missing. The reflections in the floor there doesn't look as realistic. The shadowing underneath the cars isn't as realistic. The shadowing on the bottom of that sign isn't there. The glow from that light at the top there just isn't reflecting as realistically. And there's not quite as accurate shading underneath people walking. And then we turn the path tracer back on. Oh yeah, look at that. The extra pink glow from the lighting in the background there across the road. I think every single light source is now affected by the path tracing now as well. So you can see those neon signs on the left there. Let's go back to the normal ray tracing. Yeah, the reflections in the ceilings just doesn't look as accurate at all. It looks more pixelated, and there's just not as much glow from those neon signs. But we are at over 100 FPS, so you do sacrifice about 20 FPS. Probably also see a bit more better shading on those right bits, those little wires on the wall there, and along that red neon sign. Let's turn the path tracer back on, and keep an eye out on those reflections and shadows. Like I said, the much softer lighting there, and the much softer shadows in that right bit along that red neon light there, and those wire things on the wall. Back to normal ray tracing. Oh yeah, look at the difference there. You're still getting that ray tracing effect, but the lack of light bounces really becomes apparent. How the light affects that dude, and how there's a lack of shadow. And you'll even see in the corners there, on that red bit on the curb. Let's turn the path tracer back on. It's starting to look like a film. Like a CG film. And of course, CG films use path tracers, so it makes sense. Let's go to a slightly more darker area in the corner here. So you're getting a lot of light bouncing in from the sun down here, even though it is a slightly dark area in between these bins here. Path tracing off. Oh yeah, look. It's just like too bright. There's too much light in that back bit. There's not enough shadow and ambient occlusion going on. And then back to rasterization to see how that looks. Yeah, even more flat lighting. Really, really limited in rasterization. And then back to ray tracing. Much more realistic lighting, but still not quite there. And then full path tracing. Oh, man. Another interesting area to look at here. We've got reflections in the ground, on the ceiling. Plenty of lighting. Nice little bits of shadow in that little kiosk there. Let's flick back to normal ray tracing. Yeah, there's a lot of detail and lighting lost on the characters. Shadowing is downgraded. And again, just those reflections The lighting underneath that little alcohol store there, or whatever it is, just doesn't look as bright or as impactful. And that neon sign on the left there just doesn't have as much effect on the scenery. And then we flick back to normal rasterization. So no ray tracing at all. And yep, definitely looks rasterized. That shadowing has lost completely all subtlety and softness in that little kiosk. That light is having pretty much no effect on anything other than the screen space reflections above and below. And the characters look oddly lit compared to the environment they're in. Oh, and also on the right there, that light in the ceiling, the reflection looks completely wrong with the screen space reflections. So let's go back to full path tracing. Ooh, yeah. Look at that. Characters much more naturally lit. It's the characters, that's the other big thing, the characters just being so much more well lit. And these outside areas, my god. Reflections on the cars as well. In fact, let's call up one of these cars. Ooh, there we go. So the main character still doesn't reflect in the cars, but the cars do reflect the entirety of the world around them otherwise. Oh man, look at that reflection there. Let's go back to standard ray tracing. It still looks pretty good, but there's something a little less accurate about it. It looks a bit more blurry as well. And then, of course, all of the other lighting around it will be affected in that as well, because it won't be reflecting all the other shadowing and advanced lighting that path tracing does. And if we go back to normal rasterization, just a simple cube map. And let's crank it all the way back up to path tracing. Ooh, man. Yeah, the reflection itself looks amazing, and of course it's reflecting all that extra lighting that's being done by the path tracing. Alright, let's head out into the desert area and see what that looks like. So already, just looking, this looks... Oh wow, that actually looks incredible. My god. There's certainly a difference when you're under more natural light than Night City's neon-filled streets. It's starting to feel a little bit like Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition, where the lighting is starting to almost trick your eyes and your brain into looking real. So let's flick it down to just normal ray tracing, which still looks really good, but there's that subtle subconscious thing missing where the lighting just doesn't look quite as right. Unfortunately, there's a bit of flickering on the ground there. It looks like some Z fighting, which is a shame. That's taking it out a little bit. So it still looks good. It's just lacking that little extra realism. But if we go back down to pure rasterization, we lose even more of that detail. A lot of light leaking. No shadows underneath those benches. Just screen space ambient occlusion, which doesn't look as good at all. And then all the way back to path tracing. And quite a bit of an FPS hit, but... far more realistic, much more true to life in terms of the shadow under here, but also you'd still be getting little bits of sunshine bouncing in there. DLSS 3 and upscaling really helps keep it a smooth playable frame rate, which otherwise wouldn't be possible, because pure path tracing, even for the RTX 4090 in a game like this, is pretty heavy duty. Now Quake 2 RTX has full path tracing, but it's a much more simple and smaller game, so it's geometrically simpler, which means all the boundary volume hierarchy stuff is much more easier to process, and it's much smaller, and there's less lighting and things going on. But in this game there's just a ton of detail, which is why Quake 2 RTX can have quite a high frame rate without DLSS. But this really needs DLSS and frame generation. Let's have a look how it affects the shadowing on this car, which looks amazing. So that's the full path tracer, 110 FPS, down to just ray tracing. Yeah, very subtle. Doesn't look quite as present in the scene because the lighting's not affecting it quite so well. And then down to rasterization, and yeah, it really looks flat. And then again, straight back up to the path tracer. You can see the shadows closer to it on the ground on its left side are much sharper because they're closer to where it's casting the shadow from. But the shadows from the bonnet on the front of it look a little bit more blurred because you're getting that shadow Nyumbra effect. Wow, that is really nice. Again, just insanely accurate reflections here. Christ. One of the other things that ray tracing really helps is lighting and foliage. So you can see the rotating shadow there going around. Also the shadows that are just naturally there under the bushes there. And that lighting just on the tower of the wind generator. That looks really realistically lit. Turn off path tracing. Still looks really good. Just a lot of accuracy lost. And then as we move into rasterization, still looks good, but there's a lot of shadowing missing and not quite as accurate under the bushes. The shadow of the wind generator doesn't look as accurate, especially as it goes over those bushes. The shadowing underneath that bush in the middle there just doesn't look accurate at all. Still looks good though, but as we path trace the whole thing, all just looks a lot more correct. Just look at this here. This is the kind of thing, even only a few years ago, I think you'd only really get in pre-rendered. If you go back in time and show this to yourself 20 years ago, it's just astounding. It looks astounding. And with HDR on as well. Unfortunately, I can't record in HDR, but HDR is on in my monitor. The luminance values feel so right out in the sun that it almost feels like I'm out there in this desert. Like I almost feel the dry heat. And here we have another fantastic area for showing this sort of thing off. You've got the light coming in from the sun, the dark areas. Path tracing handling it really nicely. Again, characters lit realistically, shadowing where there should be. The ambient occlusion looks fantastic. So as we turn off the path tracer, we'll see how that's affected. Oh, you can immediately see there's less sunlight reflecting off that little umbrella there. That little orange shine has gone. And then as we go downwards to just pure rasterization, much more flat lighting, especially in the little details on the curbs. And then all the way back to full path tracing. Far more realistic lighting there. Although I think that orange glow from the umbrella may have been because the sun position slightly moving. Although you can still see there's a little extra glow on it anyway. So I think that is part of the path tracer. So here we go, as a good example. Each individual light is now fully path traced as opposed to relying on rasterization. So you get more shadows from things, especially in these internal areas, which also explains why there's so much more light overall in the game. So this with the path tracing on, you can see this shadow here, extra lighting down there. Just the whole area looks completely illuminated correctly, full global illumination. And then as we go down to normal ray tracing, you can see a lot of that shadowing is missing, a lot of that lighting is missing. And that's because a lot of these lights are reverting to rasterization. So you can see under the bin on the right there, there's just less shadowing. And overall the scene is just less well illuminated. And as we go down to rasterization on its own, you can really see the scene loses even more detail. And as we go back up to ray tracing, some of the stuff is fixed and updated, but there's still quite a lot of reliance on rasterization. And then of course the full path tracing changes the look of the entire scene, and it just looks a hell of a lot better because all of these lights now are affecting the environment in terms of shadowing and lighting. Especially this area back here. You can see there's details, shading, light bouncing, light from the outside coming in. And as we go down to ray tracing without path tracing and some of the fallback to rasterization for a lot of the lighting, you can see a lot of accuracy is lost in the scene. And then even more flatter when you go down to rasterization. And all the way back up to full path tracing where all the lights now affect the scene. Much more realistically lit. And again, this bit here, let's go back to the old ray tracing on its own. You see a lot of that detail lacking on the bin there, on the right. Shadowing. Characters look wrongly illuminated because of the full back to rasterization and full shadowing from everything. I believe on this old setting, the main light source is from the sun and everything else has limited rasterization. And then back up to full path tracing again. The shadowing under that little trolley as well, combined with the reflections, really, really good. The lighting on the characters makes a big difference as well. A lot less like they're glowing, again, without that rasterization fallback and full path tracing. Now as we've moved the time of day to the morning, you can now see there's sunlight coming in down here, which also adds to the scene, so you've got extra lighting from that, as well as the lighting still coming from the neon signs, and we lose a lot of that detail when we go back to ray tracing. With the rasterization fallbacks, a lot of detail lost in that shadowing. As we go around here, we'll also see the same. So back to the bin. Let's turn that path tracing back on and have full global illumination from all the lighting. So much more realistic. Really captures that feel of Night City during the day. And here we have another fantastic area. We've got the sunlight out here. Then a much darker area in here. So this is with the path tracing on. Full lighting from the sun. Huge amount of detail. As we go back to non-path tracing ray tracing, a lot of detail lost in that shadowing. And then as we go back to rasterization, start to get that really artificial light look. And then all the way back to path tracing. And it just makes a huge difference. Just amazing how much of a leap it is to go from ray tracing to path tracing, and then even from rasterization all the way up to full path tracing. Let's go back to rasterization. Yeah, look at the glow, the artificial glow around that area down there. Just doesn't take into account the fact the sun's being blocked or anything like that. And then up to ray tracing. Fixes some of that lighting, makes the ambient occlusion down there a lot more realistic. And then full path tracing, and it's that extra touch on top. You've got the extra sort of natural glow from the sun bouncing in. The occlusion here, really accurate. And even the light from the little screen on the gun there looks a lot better. It's just phenomenal as you go in from lighter areas to darker areas. So this with the full path tracing on. You can see there's sunlight bouncing in, but it's still quite dark. So if we go down to ray tracing, again, still looks good, but it's not quite as accurate. And then down to rasterization. Oh yeah, completely unnatural glow as there's just light leaking, and the screen space ambient occlusion is unable to take into account the actual location of where it is versus the sunlight bouncing in. And then let's crank it all the way to path tracing. Oh yeah, that is a hell of a leap. Just really nice shadowing with everything. That's what really gives these areas that kind of photoreal look. Let's move the time forward. And here we are at night time, where of course all the neon lighting comes out. See, it always looks like it's been raining, but it very rarely actually rains in the non-modded version of Cyberpunk, which is always really weird. But it does really show off those reflections. That just looks so incredible. Again, it feels like you can almost feel the foggy weather there. It's starting to feel a bit cold and wet through the monitor. It's really weird. And again, let's go through to normal ray tracing. Still a lot of detail, still looks really good, but just a lot less light effect from those distant lights. Still better than rasterization though, which looks like this. Before we head into V's flat, let's have a look at this area. The classic area from the opening of the game. Full path tracing on. And as you'll see when we go down to ray tracing, much less of an effect. The characters there are much less well lit. That garage bit under NCPD doesn't look as well lit. And then as we reduce to rasterization, even more of that detail lost. Still looks really good, don't get me wrong, but it's just a lot less realistically lit until we activate that path tracer again. Although it does look like there's some strange artifacting going on over here. It looks like that is some sort of reflective surface. And there's something going on with certain rays picking up things that's making it sparkle like that. That's interesting. Yeah, you can see that sort of temporal effect there. Sort of swimming in the light. Little firefly effect. I think that's because of the temporal nature of ray tracing and path tracing. You can't accumulate enough rays without hitting performance really hard in one frame. So you accumulate rays over multiple frames, and that's how you can end up with weird artifacting like that. So here we are in V's flat with a full path tracer on. Again, incredibly realistic lighting and shadowing. Giving it that almost photoreal effect. And looking phenomenal. Especially in that bathroom area. Let's do a comparison again. Ray tracing. Just a loss of detail and lighting. Shadowing's a lot less realistic. And then down to rasterization. Basically no shadowing under that chair. reflections look all smeared because of screen space reflections. And all the way back to path tracing. Much more realistic shadowing under the desk there. Neon glow. And the lighting in that bathroom again. And here, let's cycle through them again. Path tracing. Ray tracing. And just rasterization. It's a really good future-looking technology. Path tracing, I think, will become a thing, definitely, if not before it's replaced by neural rendering, which is also going to be coming along as well. I think this is just really cool. The only downside is that, yeah, it does require RTX 4080 or a 3090, so yeah, it's going to take a lot, especially to run it at 4K, splashing out that amount of money just for this upgrade. I think this is very much an early adopters kind of thing, because I think in a couple of years there'll just be much more cost-effective and value-for-money cards that will offer better looks than this in terms of path tracing, especially with Nvidia and their bizarre reluctance to just reduce the price of their GPUs, even though they probably very easily could, and still maintain their massive profit margin, which is really annoying because this technology should be available to so many more people because it does look fantastic. As I say, it's like a pre-rendered CG movie. So I think Digital Foundry have their video out on it now. That would be definitely worth checking out because they'll do a much deeper dive than me into this. This is just a very high level look into it. We just have quite a bit of a way to go in terms of not having to use frame generation and also being able to use DLAA on its own without upscaling to keep that internal ray count higher. And then also dealing with the temporal artifacting of ray tracing, where we can get enough hardware power to crank out enough rays in one frame to get a fully rendered scene without having to accrue rays over a series of frames. That's the next goal. Oh my god, would you look at that? Ooh. Of course, what we can do is go into photo mode. Oh man. Oh man, that looks so phenomenal. Although, interestingly, as we saw on the photo mode there, it looks like we've got screen space fallbacks for distant objects. Look at that. Interesting. Let's see what that looks like without path tracing. Yep, still screen space fallbacks. And then rasterization. Oh yeah. So it appears with distant objects, it does fall back to screen space. Interesting. Let's get closer and turn path tracing back on. Although, it does look like... It looks like that's still being path traced, because that reflection does look better than screen space. I wonder if it just culls the rays after a certain point. See if we can get closer. Very interesting. Those signs up ahead, they're about the same distance away. And they're not disappearing off the screen. I wonder why the fish disappear off screen. I wonder if it's because they're so high up. They still look better and more realistic in terms of the reflection than screen space. Because if we go straight back to screen space, yeah, not as accurate at all. Path tracing back on. So it looks like for really distant objects, there's still some sort of ray culling going on. But it's not with other distant objects, because everything else seems to keep being reflected no matter how far away it is. I wonder why just those fish were getting removed off screen. I Oh my god, look at the colors. Look at all the colors. Oh my god. You can see those little fireflies in the reflections there. That sort of temporal anomaly. Almost makes it look like it's rain hitting the floor. You can see in the car there, looks a little bit funky on the textures. And on the outside there. And those fireflies dancing around in the barbed wire up there. I think those are all temporal anomalies. Just from rays building up over the course of many frames. Let's do one last comparison here. This with full path tracing on. Let's turn the path tracing off. Oh yeah. That effect of the light is just so strong with path tracing. And it's just really missing out with just ray tracing. Even some of the shadowing on those trees and grass and that bit on the right there doesn't look as good. And then down to rasterization. Still looks great, but it's a much more flat picture. And again, let's take it all the way up to the path tracing. Oh man, that lighting just all comes back to life. The effect on the trees and the grass. You can really see it as it cycles through those colors. That is amazing. And then finally what we'll do is we'll turn on DLAA. So we're at 80 FPS there. That's native 4K. Which means we're getting the full amount of rays coming out there for each pixel. And we're down to 30 FPS. But there's a lot less fireflies. Look how much more stable the reflections are with just DLAA on. And once you get that temporal accumulation of rays, the fireflies along the barbed wire there are much more reduced when we get in the car. The textures look a lot less funky as we get in. And then as we turn DLSS upscaling back on, the frame rate jumps up much higher, but still you're getting that loss of temporal stability in the reflections. If we turn DLSS frame generation off, we're back down to about 30 frames. Temporal stability is pretty much the same. I don't think DLSS frame generation really affects the ray tracing effect too much. Frame generation back on. So yeah, the ideal way to run it would be DLAA. Hopefully when the 5090 comes out, that will run it. And here we are, back near where we started the video. Let's park up here. My God, that looks amazing. And let's zoom forward to daytime. And here we are, one of the rare times that we've got fog. Which gives the game a really spooky atmospheric feel. So let's do one last comparison here while we've got this weather. So with path tracing, down to ray tracing, and down to rasterization. Just see the reflections in those windows being the main point here. And all the way back up to path tracing. That atmosphere, even just the reflection of my windows is enough. The extra ambient occlusion and shadowing really sells that Blade Runner-y effect. Holy crap. I think I've said it before, but I imagine in a few years when you've got a Stalker Gamma-like mod pack installation for this, and you've got the path tracing on with DLA. Oh, this will be perfect. So there we go, my high-level overview there of Cyberpunk 2077 1.62 patch with Overdrive path tracing, and it looks phenomenal. Like I said, it's not quite worth the price of admission of having to get a 3090 or a 4090 or whatever it is they recommend, but my God, is it a step forward. Really cleans up the ray tracing overall and makes the graphics look phenomenal. It just looks like a CG film, like something Pixar would make. It's amazing. It's honestly crazy to look down and see my PC down here and just know that that's running it in real time. If you like that video, please do leave a comment and let me know what you think. Do you think it's worth the price of admission? Or do you think that by the time graphics cards will be able to render this sort of path tracing on all games at a reasonable price, they'll have been overtaken by neural rendering? Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video.